we are pleased to have Mr. Aidan Baigrie from SEACOM will be giving the keynote. He's the head of business development at SEACOM. And his keynote is, we think, is really relevant to the theme of this year's AfPIF3 event, which is addressing Africa's internet transit deficit. And we hope to learn and know what, from SEACOM's point of view, their perspective with respect to how the role submarine cables will play in impacting this internet ecosystem in this region. So, Mr. Aidan, please welcome.
Thank you, Mitchell. Thanks. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I just want to forward a note I got from our CEO, who's in Australia right now for family reasons. But he just wanted to send his apologies and said he regrettably can't be here. And he wishes a very successful conference. And I'm very much looking forward to cooperating with AfPIF and ISOC to ensure continued African internet growth into the future. So apologies on his behalf. But I'm here and I'll try and keep you entertained and hopefully answer some difficult questions at the end that I'll no doubt receive. So yes, firstly, it's a pleasure for SEACOM to be here and to sponsor this event. We don't sponsor a lot of events anymore, and this one is very special to us for the reasons that we're all here. We've had our tagline as building an African internet for a couple of years, and you know, the nice thing about these sort of events is it really forces you to try and get some sort of tangible understanding as to what an African internet is. It's an easy word to throw around, but what does it really mean? So today I'm going to dig into a few things. I'm going to talk about demand, what we're seeing happening in Africa, just a snapshot on some of the demand figures that I find very exciting, a vision of the African internet as we see it. And again, you know, with all things internet, there's no finite methodology or rule that determines exactly what an African internet is, but I'll just run through some of the components for us that we see as essential ingredients. I will then also talk about, I guess, how we feel our responsibility is and where it lies in terms of building an African internet, and then I'll just close off with a quick summary. Let me just get this right. Great. Okay, so where was Africa when we started SEACOM in 2009 when I joined? This was the view that we saw as a submarine cable provider. A map that showed the least populated inhabitable continent on Earth. Someone pointed out that Antarctica is probably less penetrated than Africa. So it's now the least penetrated inhabitable continent. And also we saw this traffic flow diagram from telegeography. And this is a more modern version of the one we saw, but really it highlights, even today, the gap in transferring of traffic and throughput between the continents. And really this spelt a very clear opportunity, which was compounded by our view on what was likely to happen to demand, or was happening to demand in 2008, 2009 when we got going. Firstly, just a global view on demand, and I've got a little footnote at the bottom there which speaks to penetration in Africa. And the message there is that, you know, I know in South Africa, for example, of the 10 million users of internet we have here, 8 million are connecting through fixed mobile or wireless devices. It's sending a really key signal that, you know, all the naysayers who were saying, you know, unless you've got fiber to the home, you'll never really be able to compete on a global stage. I think we've really proven as a continent that using the best and latest mobile technologies, we've managed to overcome and will continue to overcome the hurdles of lack of fixed line connectivity. So I think mobile for me is very much the flavor of growth that I just want to go through in the next few slides. You can see there, and I'm not sure if you can read in the diagram, but it shows you that a smartphone consumes 35 times the bandwidth of a normal feature phone. We know that smartphones nowadays, I was reading a report yesterday, they're saying that Android-based smart touch phones are expected to be sold for under $50 in certain places in Africa next year. Just gives you an idea of the likely penetration of smartphones in the near future. And you can imagine the impact that's going to have on demand, considering the mobile penetration rates in Africa, or at least some penetration rates, are sitting in the 80s, 70, 80% as the continent as a whole. Cisco predicted that they do a V&I report every year, that mobile devices will surpass the population of the world by the end of the year. The US mobile devices did that in 2011, where they surpassed the population of the US. And it's just setting a global view on what's happening with mobile devices. And smartphones are the largest consumers of mobile data. Okay, so you can see I'm building a picture here. As we zoom into Africa, the V&I report said that their prediction between 2011 and 2016 is a 105%, 104% CAGR in terms of growth. And the compounded annual growth rates, in simpler terms, I guess, is saying a 36-fold increase from 2011 to 2016 in terms of mobile demand and consumption. Now, the quick argument there is, well, if you're on a small base, it's pretty easy to have 36-fold growth if you're starting off with 1 megabit. But even if you look at a mature economy like South Africa in the V&I report was sitting at 155% CAGR, which gets over 50-fold growth. So again, the picture here is very much one of extreme growth, especially as our smartphones replace the traditional mobile phones. Okay. I came across a report from the UN at the beginning of the year, and I must just give a health warning to it. It's not necessarily directly relevant, but I'm painting a picture for you. They did a report on all the countries and continents in the world and said if the growth rates continue at the current rates of today, where is Africa going to look like by 2100? Okay, now we know growth rates are going to change, and there are a whole bunch of elements in growth rates, but the picture I just wanted to show you, I think will be as surprising for you as it was for me. Population. Africa, 14.9 billion, 15 billion, which is more than the cumulative population of the rest of the world in 2100. Average age, 18.4, the youngest continent in the world by 2100. Now, there are two ways to look at it, and from my perspective, and the reason we're all here is a positive one, which is there's a lot of growth that's happening from a population level. We're seeing growth at a technology level. We're seeing the evolution of the mobile networks, the integration of smartphones into our daily lives, and a population that is young and growing and intelligent. And the combination for us is a view that's all about growth. And the reason this is, an intro to this sort of presentation is it's very easy to come along and say, well, there are a lot of submarine cables and, there are a lot of phones and all that, but demand's going to taper out in Africa. We don't see that happening, and we don't believe that will happen. Okay, so demand in one day. These are some fun stats that I came across, which is what is consumed in the internet in an average day. 172 million unique people visited Facebook, let's call it yesterday. 400 million queries on Google. 865,000 hours of video uploaded onto YouTube. And 294 billion emails sent. Now, my CEO emailed me last night in a panic, and he said, how can you say 294 billion emails? Because, that means about 50 emails a person all over the world, which doesn't sound realistic. And after digging into the numbers, which I must remind you is always healthy, we realized that 90% of that, or 95% of that, was actually spam and robot-generated emails, and that the real number is closer maybe to 10 billion or 15 billion emails sent. Anyway, amazing numbers there, looking at Facebook, Google, and YouTube. And I think what's amazing to me, as someone who's evolved with SEACOM since the start, is if you look at those first three bullets and those companies, you've got to ask them what their assets are. And the assets are very different to those on the Fortune 500 or Fortune 50 some years ago. They're using our information, our intellectual property, aggregating it and sharing it. It's a completely different model to anything that we've looked at in the past, and a very exciting time. Okay, so just before I go into SEACOM's view on the African internet, there was one other thing that I like to share as a story, and SEACOM likes to share, which is understanding that this demand that we're seeing today wouldn't happen without people understanding how price and affordability can generate more demand than it loses in revenues. And I'll explain that just with a diagram that I like to use. And I'm going to see if this pointer works, so bear with me. Actually, I'm not even going to try. I'm going to get this wrong. If you look at the graph on the left there, that was the perceived demand when we entered the market. And what that shows you is that as you drop price, okay, on the vertical axis, your increase in demand is not very big. So if you're sitting as an incumbent, you sit there, let's say, at the dotted line, and you say, well, look, I can charge high pricing. We've got a relatively inelastic demand. If we up our prices, we don't lose a lot of customers. And if we drop our prices, we don't gain a lot of customers. It's a very narrow-minded view, but it's one that's based on a premise that price isn't really going to affect demand. And we heard that story a lot when we were launching in the early days. People would come up to SEACOM and say, there isn't the demand in East Africa for a submarine cable. Look at the consumption today. How are you guys going to get your return on investment? What we've seen, and the guiding sort of premise for us in terms of pricing, is the graph on the right. And that graph is a very different graph. That's an elastic graph. And what that shows is that as we've dropped prices, and as we've seen prices drop, and this applies at a submarine level, and I'll give you some examples shortly, but also at all types of levels, whether it's backhaul, whether it's equipment, whether it's licensing, whether it's call per minute, is that dropping pricing has spiked demand and has created a platform that gives us this very exciting discussion set of topics today, which is about the growth of Africa and how we best create an environment of sharing, peering, and communication within that environment. Here's some of the results we've seen since launch, and I'm very quick to show this to anyone who says, all these cables arriving, but it really hasn't made stuff faster in the country. Price 2009, $3,000 per megabit, and we saw that a lot in Tanzania and Kenya and certain parts of South Africa and Southern Africa. We're looking in 2012, price per megabit in the submarine cables, $100 and dropping. If you look at the price per megabyte, I remember if I had a 3G card and had to pay for a megabyte in Jan 2009, when I was with SEACOM, we were paying the equivalent of 3 Rand or 25 US cents a megabyte for downloading. Today we're sitting at 1 cent, and that should be a US dollar, not a Rand, but 1 cent per megabyte, or South African cents, it's about 8 to 10 cents currently. So we're talking about multiples of declines in pricing, and really a picture to everyone that says pricing has come down, and yet Africa's looking good. People are doing well, the businesses are getting their return on investment because of that elasticity. Moving on to the African internet, and this is a term that our marketing team and many people in this room have been using a lot over the last few years, and what I enjoy about these sort of conferences, and today filling in for Mark and discussing it with Mark, about how we put this together, is it forces us to look introspectively and think about what really an African internet is and what it represents. And initially, the management consulting side of me came out and said, okay, well, we need a modular graph. We need to have, puzzle pieces that go in and they make a mutually inclusive view on all the different components. And the first thing Mark said to me was, he said, Aidan, the internet derived almost out of chaos theory. The last thing you want to do is try and compartmentalize or logically construct a perfect African internet, which is great. So it led us into a different way of thinking about it. And I guess what I've thought about in a different way is, what are the ingredients then, certain things that we see as key elements of building an African internet? Reliable and pervasive infrastructure, an infrastructure at every level, whether it's subsea, whether it's terrestrial, whether it's POPs, whether it's exchange points, making sure that infrastructure, the power that's needed to power the base stations, those of the base stations that aren't already powered by wind or energy or will be shortly in the future. IP enablement and peering. We initially launched SEACOM with a submarine cable under the sea and a very basic IPL set of services, a point-to-point pipe. And our product team with a lot of vision said to us, you need to really evolve as a business, or we need to evolve and look at what's next. And it started to train ourselves on what IP is all about. And all of us have been learning, and we got Dr. Peering, Bill, to come in and have a discussion with us and enlighten us and teach us a bit more about what that means to our network and how we could use that to differentiate ourselves in a market that's becoming fiercely competitive. And then, of course, there's building local content. The stats are pretty dismal right now if we look at content coming into Africa. And the IP networks or the IP transit providers will tell you, and we see it, that to date, there's a very small amount of content generated in Africa. And yet, and maybe I'm biased here, but I do believe we're probably the most interesting continent on Earth in terms of diversity and what's unknown to the rest of the world. So we really see an environment, and again, this creating this IXP type environment where we can start generating and sharing content, not always via London, but between each other on the African continent. And of course, a well-oiled regulatory framework. Now, the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz had more reference when Mark, our Australian CEO, was presenting, being the Wizard of Oz for us. But really the point there is that the regulatory environment is essential, because to create these peering hubs or to start to see Africa more in a union perspective and as regional components pulling us together as a group, we need to ensure that we have that regulatory oil that allows us to interact and not replicate every part of the framework in each country and start to function as unions and regions. So, key ingredients that we see as essential building blocks. Fostering connectivity through national networks, metro networks, access networks, subsea networks. Fiber to enterprises, but accepting that fiber to the home is a wonderful ideal, but let's not underestimate what mobile is going to do in that space. Carrier neutral data centers, easily accessible open access exchanges. Peering and sharing of local content, reducing the costs. Intelligent IP-based networks. Cloud and mobile integration into basic mobile services, hosting of content locally to provide true mature market experiences. We would like to see more e-services and e-government services. We see wonderful pilots in the rest of the world and success in other countries and continents. We're in a unique position to leapfrog, which Africa's done so well historically, and bring these best practices into the country. We know we need to work on reliability of the subsea and terrestrial cables. We're working on it every day, and for us, cables go down, and what we've discovered is, from a SEACOM perspective, the best way for us is to build a network and position ourselves as a network of cables. On the terrestrial side, terrestrial cables need to be built reliably and effectively, not laid upon the ground, but dug deeply. We need multiple routes. We need alignment between the infrastructure arms of government and the telco side of government. We had a wonderful story, or a sad story, depending on how you view it, in one of the countries where the Ministry of Infrastructure, the Ministry of Telecoms, approved a fiber along the edge of a road project with hundreds of kilometers of fiber aligned across one of the roads in Africa. And the Minister of Infrastructure, a week later, approved a road straightening program where they proceeded to cut a straight line across the whole windy road for 100 kilometers. I think that 42 breaks in about 4 days. So another example of regulatory union and communication within regions, but also within countries. And also we've seen, sadly, that many data centers are still overcharging, and that's why it's been good to have the guys of Terrico coming in with a very progressive view on pricing and really creating those exchange environments where you're not crippled with this inelastic view that you can charge what you want in a data center and people will come in. And that market's changing, which we enjoy. National transit. This has been a really enlightening story for me. And Severe, our head of product strategy, is here, and we were chatting about this some minutes ago. But for us to get national transit in South Africa is more expensive than getting national transit for the rest of the world combined as a business. So for anyone who's buying SEACOM's IPT products, please don't surf locally, surf the international websites and to help us in our business model. But seriously, this is something that needs to change and has to change. It is ridiculous that it is cheaper for customers to surf locally than to go and surf abroad. Cheaper to surf abroad than locally. So this is something, again, the IXPs peering are enabling factors to ensure that we make it affordable and accessible for everyone to get this critical growth, this mass that we need to grow the African internet. Yeah, and I think the final point, again, which is close to SEACOM, and it's really something for us that we can play a space in, is understanding that there's one thing having an IP network within a country, but what we need is IP networks connecting across regions and across the continent. And that's another thing that we need to work on to build an African internet. Other hurdles. Cloud providers are finding it costly to place equipment in country. We've noticed that when we chat to the Googles and we chat to the guys on the west coast of the US, and you chat to them about plans coming into Africa, and maybe Google isn't a specific example, but really it's cloud providers as a whole. A lot of the challenges are finding ways to enter into Africa where you don't have all the sovereign disparity between each country with different guidelines, different rules, different structures. We've seen issues with SLAs where a lot of the major carriers are looking for a single SLA. If you look at the global carriers coming in here, they'll have a discussion with us and say, look, we'd like to get to these points in Africa. And our challenge is, sure, we can provide the subsea portion. We'll chat to DFA or perhaps someone else to provide the terrestrial portion. Then we'll chat to someone else to provide the access portion. And they come back to us and say, well, this is not how we work. We want a single SLA. And this also opens up the door for us to start thinking about how we can work together and provide services that are integrated to the rest of the world to get us onto that page. I've spoken a bit about national policy and also regulatory. The impact of trying to isolate one's country too much works against regional benefits. I thought I'd give us a quick zoom in, sort of an introductory view on the average journey of a byte. And this really explains what happens when a byte goes from the internet, which is see all the colored blocks in the cloud, and the journey that it travels to get to a mobile phone or a home somewhere in Africa. And it's the same, the components are the same everywhere in the world. But really what's key to understand here is how many different components there are between your cloud provider, then you've got SEACOM, which is your submarine cable provider. You're then going through into finding a local POP. Then you've got a long-haul provider that brings you into a city. Then you've got metro fiber. From the metro fiber, you get closer to the BTSs. And from the BTSs or the base stations, you're then on a wireless network that gets to your mobile phone. So really a lot of components. And if these components don't work together, you don't get the economies of scale or the pricing that allows for an affordable African internet experience, which is why we see a lot of the future is part of the sharing. And we're seeing it in the mobile spaces. We're seeing it with American Towers and Eaton Towers. We're doing tower sharing for a lot of the mobile operators all over the world, and in Africa specifically. And we see that very much as a future, a way of keeping costs down. And as we showed earlier, when costs go down, demand goes up, and everyone benefits. So the next question which we had when we were discussing this presentation was, what is SEACOM's role here? What do we feel responsible to contribute to this process? How can we help it? Because at the end of the day, it sounds all great to say, how can we build the African internet? But it obviously serves us as well. A growing internet means growing demand in submarine cables, and it of course means growing socioeconomic growth for Africa as a whole, which are very much the core pillars in which our business was founded on. So we see the role of ourselves, and maybe this is a question to all submarine networks out there, or a statement, but working as a network of cables. No longer one cable. One cable is not enough. We need to be a network of cables, and we need to see ourselves not even as cable providers, but as a network. We believe our role is to provide full IP services over the network and make sure those services are resilient, protected, and reliable to ensure that we can start connecting the countries amongst Africa at the same affordable rates that we brought into Africa or East Africa some years ago. We believe our role is to create partnerships and work together with the terrestrial providers to make sure that we can help provide single SLAs to customers and provide the international customers with a level of quality that they expect out of a mature market, which we believe Africa will become and is becoming. We believe that partnership models between players is another one of our responsibilities. We were having discussions with one of the players yesterday about how we can make fiber more affordable for ISPs who want to get them into businesses. And I'll give you an example here, but there are probably 40 or 50 big office parks in South Africa that have fiber running right past the doorstep, but no fiber going inside of the buildings. And the question we sat there and had in the discussion was, it's amazing that we're all in this demand for fiber to the X and fiber into the businesses, and yet we've got fiber at the doorsteps we're not using. And when we unpacked the model a bit, we discovered that the challenge is that for an ISP to procure the dark fiber or fiber to the edge of the building, to build the access into the various buildings inside, to then procure the subsea capacity from SEACOM or another submarine cable, when you put that together, it creates such a capex hurdle or barrier to entry that suddenly they need 100 businesses as guaranteed offtake before they progress with the model. And which is ridiculous, because then you get that chicken and egg scenario where you say to the businesses, well, you can try fiber if you're prepared to commit to it. And that is sort of counter as to how we've seen the African internet grow, which is really try it and grow on it. So we see our responsibility as a network to help look at partnerships that can make those models more interesting and more attractive, to make sure that all of us get more fiber into the businesses and that everyone gets some reward from the wonderful infrastructure actually that we have in many cases. We see our responsibility as providing exchange points in selected POPs and helping and supporting those exchange points wherever they are. Again, this is something that both serves us and serves the industry, which is an ideal point for a business to be in. And also, we see our responsibility with the network that we have around Africa to try and enable the arrival of cloud service companies and the building of cloud service initiatives within Africa to come to fruition. And we've got a spin-off from our business called Pamoja, which is in its startup phase now. But really what they're looking at is to help build a local cloud and develop local cloud applications and provide an ecosystem of cloud services that can help small businesses and bigger businesses and consumers access cloud in a very local fashion. So they're setting up local POPs and local exchange points within Africa along our cable, and we're supporting that with bandwidths to try and help that. So you'll hear more about them in the future, I'm sure. So we still have some challenges to overcome, but really I think I just want to finish off with a summary on our view here, which is we need a clear vision to achieve an African internet. It's not enough to talk about it. We need an action plan and a vision, and we need to identify how all of us can play a role in building that. I think we all, I hope, have got the message from our side, the role of affordable pricing. I think we all knew that already, but really just shown from our side with practical numbers and experience and how large the potential demand really is and the demand that we've seen. And I think we have as good understanding as we can at this stage of an African internet, and it's very much our focus as a Pan-African network to try and help that become a reality. And let's continue pushing. Let's keep these events going and make the event bigger and better next year and grow it. And as I said, the message from Mark earlier, we look forward to supporting this event or cooperating with this event and ISOC and help all of us benefit from a wonderful African internet. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
All right, so I'm sure most of you have burning questions. So we'll do the Q&A right now before we go out for lunch. So if I could have the people with the mics, let's try and take at least one at a time. Or you can sit if you want. All right.
Okay, Graham here from Eology. Hello. Okay,
Hi.
Graham here from Eology. I just wanted to find out, are you guys still pricing your circuits on your cable the same regardless of how many kilometers they run on the cable?
We never actually did that. Our pricing was the same regardless of where our original pricing when we came in. We had a set pricing for all countries in Africa. So that was part of our open access approach, was that no countries would get beneficial pricing over others. We'd price at a standard rate. What's happened as we've evolved is we've started to provide regional pricing to encourage local communication between countries. So if you're a country in Africa connecting with another country in Africa, you won't pay the same pricing as if you're going off to the rest of the world. And we did that to try and really focus and encourage getting that terrestrial, not terrestrial, but regional interconnectivity working within Africa. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Violet Litiri. I'm from ICASA. I'm just interested to hear more about where do you see the regulator playing a role in developing the regulatory framework for internet? Because I am aware that internationally people are saying that regulators should not regulate the internet, and yet you are saying that we should have a role to play.
Look, I think the role of the regulator is obviously to ensure that policy is implemented effectively. In terms of the exact engagement of the regulator in the country, I'd rather leave that to a bunch of people here who know a lot more about that sort of engagement than myself. And I'm very happy to take it offline and put you in front of some of our more experts on the regulatory side. We have experts here today. If that's okay, Violet. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Simeon. Thank you for the talk. My question is regarding your statement that you think that the cable operators should become a network. Am I understanding you correctly if you say that by that you mean that the cable operators should be in the IP transport business? And if so, why do you think that the cable operators should be in that business rather than leaving that up to ISPs and carriers and cable operators sticking to layer 2 or layer 1 transport?
Yeah. Look, I think that's a very good question. The reality is that the role of, when I say submarine cables as a network, the big challenge we have is how far down the value chain we move. You know, do we provide terrestrial service with the submarine? Do we provide access services? Do we target retail users or consumers with 3G SEACOM offerings? The reality is we're a wholesale game, but we do, as submarine cables, have a unique position to be able to provide routing at a regional level around the continent. So when I say let's get involved in the IP space, it's not about necessarily the submarine cables putting routers all over countries. For us, it's very much about allowing countries to interact with each other effectively. And that is a role that is unique and peculiar to the submarine cables because we touch so many countries around Africa. So we feel we can actually help augment the national IP work being done by specialists in that space by plugging them into a broader IP-based network, if that makes sense. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Ramkubane Matuli. I'm from the Lesotho Communications Authority, which is a regulatory body. I have a question or seek more clarity on page 23 of your presentation. I didn't quite finish copying this point, which I have a query on seek clarity on. It talks about providing capability for exchange points in selected POPs and bringing together various undersea cables, something like that. Yeah. The second point from the bottom. Providing capability for exchange point in selected POPs, bringing multiple subsea and terrestrial cables together with customers. May you clarify what exactly you mean by that and what role SEACOM envisages to play in relation to that point, please?
Thank you for the question. I think the latter part of that comment is really about us positioning SEACOM not as a cable anymore, but as a network of cables. So it allows us to have access to multiple cables around Africa, so that when a customer arrives at one of our landing points, they can hand over their subsea needs or their network needs to SEACOM as a whole and know that that's routed all around Africa as needed. So that's sort of the role of bringing multiple cables together at one point. The second element there about creating exchange points is really for us to say we have POPs in each country that we land our cable, these customer landing sites. And some stages or certain parts of Africa, they're suitable places to encourage internet exchange. And this naturally happens as customers from our service offerings come together inside our POPs and start exchanging traffic between them.
Sorry to intervene, but more clarity, perhaps sought. I don't know if I'm way ahead of discussions to follow. Does this apply to landlocked countries? Because they have rather special, they are a special case.
Sure. So what I'm referring to would relate to a landlocked country. The challenge there, and I'll give you an example, if SEACOM wants to sell services into Rwanda, our challenge to get into Rwanda is we need to get either through Tanzania or we need to take a route through Kenya and Uganda to get into the Rwanda as a landlocked country. So the role of the submarine provider there is to make sure that at a sea level, all the protection's in place, that the multiple cables are in place. The next challenge is the terrestrial portion, and this is where you rely on the Tanzanian backhaul. You know, they've got a great project there connecting all of Tanzania with fiber, and rely on the Kenyan providers to provide multiple routes into those countries. So it's really a two-phased approach. One is for the landlocked units such as Lesotho to ensure they've got multiple terrestrial fiber links coming both into the land, but also internally connecting all the metro areas and cities with multiple routes. You create almost a mesh of terrestrial fiber. That way, when those two terrestrial routes connect with a landing station or a submarine cable provider or network of providers, they ensure that that resilience is maintained at a subsea level as much as it is at the terrestrial level. Should we take it offline? Okay.
Hi, Ben Roberts from Liquid Telecom. Does this mean you'll let all your customers put routers in all your landing station POPs?
Sorry,
does this mean you'll let your customers put routers in all of your landing station POPs?
The customers will have access to our routers at all our landing station POPs. And what our customers put in there is a discussion that needs to be had with the landing stations. But yeah, customers are putting their own routers in and getting access to our routers if they're buying IP transit types of products.
So if they're buying IP transit products, then you can put your routers in at the landing station?
Sure, because that's our yeah. Sorry.
Okay, but not IPLC, not if you're buying leased circuits.
No, we can do with IPLC. I've got my queue in the stage there with the product team who are specialists in this area. Yeah.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, in the name of open peering and the rest of it, in the case of a customer putting down equipment in your landing station, if there's a peering point in your landing station, great, they connect to it, they peer with everybody else, etc. What is the viewpoint about direct interconnects with other customers of SEACOM in that landing station via direct fiber? Are there issues around that? Because I've asked this question of SEACOM many times, and I always seem to get a different answer or a different perspective.
So by putting me on the spotlight on live TV, you can get a good answer.
So I'm asking again, if we put down a router in your landing station, say for example, I stick a router down in there which is under the contract, and your other customer X puts a router down in there, and I want a direct fiber P&I between him and myself to exchange our traffic. Is SEACOM going to have an issue with that?
Look, we've brought in a wonderful IP person called Mark Tinker, who's speaking, one of the speakers here, who I'm going to leave to answer the technical questions because I have the feeling I'm not going to speak your language. But either way, this is something we have allowed and it's something we can allow. It's just about understanding what the strategic impact is for us and how that plays with the data center as a whole. As we said, SEACOM is about landing points. We haven't built carrier hotels. We have space constraints. So we have a whole bunch of factors that we need to consider when people come into our landing stations who aren't using it to connect to SEACOM. So I'd definitely rather have that discussion with somebody who knows more about it than myself, with all due respect. Okay. Sidestepped.
Hello. Hello. My name is
Hi.
Buba. I have two quick questions. I wanted to know from your perspective, what are some of the changes you've seen in data centers since SEACOM has landed? And the second one is, I know SEACOM changed the market when they landed in, I think, 2007. Now, obviously, I heard you working with WAC, you're using WACs as a redundantly, but from SEACOM's perspective, what do you expect to happen in the market when WACs goes fully live? Thank you.
Good question, thank you. There are two elements there, so I'll answer the first question on the data center side. Our experience since landing is that with demand coming up, it's or increasing as dramatically as it has since the Submarine's capacity has been available on the East Coast. It's provided a lot of competition and pressure on the POPs and data centers within South Africa as an example, as an area, which is given to the rise of players like Terraco, who are expanding rapidly. So we're seeing a great market reaction that as supply and demand, or as demand drives up, it's putting pressure on the supply side, and we're seeing a much more affordable data center environment than we saw 3 years ago, which we find very exciting. On the second question as to what will be the impact of WACS as a cable landing, or has landed on the west coast of Africa, we welcome the arrival. It provides us with what we need as a network to create that ring around Africa. Without WACS on the west coast, we didn't have that sustainable, scalable growth around Africa into the future to position ourselves as a network. So it's going to put pressure on pricing, which is good for the consumers when I put the consumer hat on. And it also provides some redundancy, especially for the sub-Saharan countries of Africa, who can really send it either way around Africa in the case of an outage. So no, we see it as a great step towards quality. And as we know, your initial step is to connect people, then the next step is to get the pricing down, and then after that follows on really building up the quality of the service, becomes the next sort of Maslowian requirement or need.
I do have a question as the moderator, so, and I'm going to put you on the spot on this one.
Can't wait.
All right. Initially, when SEACOM came into the East African coasts, there were rumors and that from London to the landing points all along the East African coasts, the price per megabit was so much lower than what most people were able to get when they got the capacity inland, and largely because of the costs of the terrestrial infrastructure that was put on by those who actually had built the infrastructure, or the partners that you had picked or you were looking to work with. I don't know whether this has changed. I know in a number of countries there have been a lot of infrastructure development, and there have been a number of new cables, terrestrial cable coming into play. The question I have is, and I really appreciate the model you've looked at to, being more than just a cable operator. What would be the actual costs if I came in and connected my laptop on an STM1 at your landing station? What would be my price per meg?
So we, there are many components, and I try to depict it in the diagram up here, and I'll just get to it. There are a lot of components that your data that you're fetching takes, from fetching it overseas to arriving at your phone. And each one of those play a role in the value chain. And what we've seen happen, I'll answer the second part of your question, I'm not avoiding it, but what we've seen happen in the value chain is that with this onslaught of submarine capacity and affordable bandwidth, it's provided a lot of pressure on the terrestrial players in country and the long-haul providers. Because what's happened is they were in a historical environment where there wasn't much subsea demand because pricing had priced it out of the market. As demand spikes, we suddenly realize we have a shortage of good fiber in the ground connecting especially the major metros. And I think what happens is there's a natural market force, which is supply skyrockets, well, demand skyrockets, sorry, and your supply is constrained. So what happened for a long period of time, and what we're seeing changing now, is those who had fiber in the ground were charging a premium. And then on top of that, you've then got the ISP, and the ISP has to buy national transit along with the international transit they're getting from SEACOM. And national transit, as I said earlier, is very expensive. So by the time it's getting to the end consumer and it's gone to the base station and fiber between the base stations and over the 3G network to the mobile phone, there are a lot of components that compound from a costing perspective that result in a more expensive price than the $50 to $100 a meg that we would charge at a wholesale rate. So I think if you were to come into our station and you were to buy a STEM 1 from SEACOM or any one of the submarine cables, you'd be sitting probably around the $100 a meg mark. Okay, but again, this is, remember we're talking megabits here, so it's a different game to what consumers see on the other side, which is megabytes. But the reality is that price goes up multiple folds as it makes its way to the end consumer. But the pricing that I showed here right in the beginning reminds you that there is still an end user impact that has been remarkable over this period of time. And the good news is, and my view is, if someone wants to charge a killing for terrestrial backhaul, they can go ahead and do it, because all they're doing is they're opening up a market for other people like SEACOM to see a gap and position themselves and charge a more affordable rate. And it really is, if it wasn't for the monopolies in Africa charging the prices they were, there would never have been a business case for the SEACOM cable. So I think it's something that what I'm saying is market forces will continually drive down.
Do we have any other questions for Aidan? Okay.
As you say, 100 USD a meg or STM1, right? As that grows, you buy STM16, STM64. I presume that that price is going to drop fairly dramatically.
Yeah.
And obviously there is some economic driver about, you know, pricing based on volume and the rest of it. What I'd like to ask is, what is the differentiator between STM1 and STM64 level, and why is that gap so huge? Particularly when you're starting to see situations in Europe where you can now buy zero commit bandwidth on a 95th percentile on an IP network.
Sure.
And your price of actually committing to bandwidth is not vastly different. And we're not talking about 5, 10 times. So what is the current differentiator between STM1 and STM64, and what justifies that vast differential?
So in terms of pricing, there are various models around the world that we've seen. So some models will go, they use a logarithmic curve where you do multiples of 3. So if you increase your demand from 1 stem to 4 stems, you'll pay a 3-fold increase. If you then go from 4 to 16, 3-fold again, which would result in a 27-fold increase from a stem 1 to a stem 64. We've seen areas in Southeast Asia and Asia where you're sitting at 15 times the price for a stem 64 and to a stem 1. I think we need to remember when we compare ourselves to very much the mature markets, we don't necessarily have the demand levels or the economies of scale that you get as a provider to get your return on investment. So where they're in a very mature market, pumping out huge amounts of large bandwidth, for us, we need to price it so that if we sold everything at a stem 64 level for the same price as a stem 1, it would effectively destroy the smaller market because everyone would then resell and resell and resell to everyone else. We also find the demand levels here are often for smaller amounts of bandwidth. And you'll probably find that by the time those stem 1 providers have moved up to a stem 64 over time, they can effectively pay probably the same price over 5 years for a stem 64 that they were paying for lower increments today. So I don't think there's a major shortcoming for businesses as a whole in the pricing structure, and I do think it encourages higher growth. It's also what we're seeing in similar markets as a standard. You know, we're in new territory here, we're pricing in new grounds, and it's already a leap forward from what was the historical pricing, where STEM 64 in many cases was 64 times the STEM 1 price.
Okay, I have one more question. So I'm bringing this from yesterday's Pairing Coordinators Day, where there was a question, or rather there was a presentation that indicated that the cost from Nairobi to Cape Town, I think, they had an STM1, and the cost per meg was slightly, at least $10 more between Nairobi, or rather Cape Town and Nairobi vis-a-vis Cape Town and London, which made it $10 more per meg to carry the traffic. What role is Safari? Sorry, I think I'm.
Never heard that.
Yeah, I know. What role is SEACOM playing in trying to make sure that the interconnection within the African region, the pricing is actually competitive enough that those who want to develop interconnection are actually looking at the infrastructure that exists? And currently, the submarine cable is well placed to drive that change. How are you looking at this from a business point of view, in view of my earlier question with respect to the pricing?
Mitchell, thanks for the question. So I think your question was saying that, for instance, between Cape Town and Joburg, a STEM 1 would be more expensive than on a subsea cable from, let's say, Mtunzini all the way up to London, purely on a submarine cable. And this is something that we've seen and is very much a function of what I was chatting about earlier, which is this role that huge amount of demand has come through on the subsea side, but limited supply. And market forces have resulted in very expensive terrestrial backhaul. We realized that very early on when we arrived at Mtunzini, and we thought that if we were just to create our sole POP, and I'm using South Africa as an example because you're talking about Cape Town, but if we were to use Mtunzini as our POP, our growth would be hindered or hamstrung by the cost of terrestrial backhaul. So we identified that, for instance, in Cape Town, there was already cable servicing the Western Cape region. We had SAT3. And so what we did is we acquired bandwidth to bring our subsea capacity to Joburg at effectively the same price as we were offering in Mtunzini. The debate which we had earlier, which is, how far down the value chain does the responsibility of the submarine cable go? That argument can keep on going. Should we be building our own fiber into the cities? Should we be building our own fiber into all the office parks? Should we be providing end consumer behavior or end consumer consumption bandwidth? The reality is, as a wholesale player, what we thought was the most effective role that we could play, allowing everyone else to play their part in the ecosystem, was to make sure that we put our bandwidth, whether it's in Nairobi or whether it's in Johannesburg or whether it's bringing it off the shore in Dar in Tanzania, in places which were accessible by large amounts of the fiber that are already in place, and then rely on market forces to drive that pricing down. And we're seeing that happen right as we speak. We've seen that cost, that Cape Town Joburg costing, probably half since the data that you received yesterday, just in the last couple of weeks. So the pricing is coming down very quickly.
But that's national. I'm looking at cross-border. That's South Africa or Mtunzini, Mombasa.
If we look at cross-border, in line with the question we had earlier, we will price our products significantly cheaper for a cross-border or intra-Africa service than we would for an international one, to try and foster that growth, and we do. So if you are finding out that, for instance, to go from Kenya to South Africa is more expensive than South Africa to London, it's not on our network.
Graham is here.
Yeah, just to clarify that whole presentation, it does run on your cable, but the costing issue wasn't your cable. It was national terrestrial fiber issues of building at that stage. It was from your POP to the location of Jinx. was actually the prohibitive cost.
Yeah.
And the transmission prices are coming down. We are seeing positive moves in that area, and I'm glad to hear that you guys have built pricing models that are going to help us in terms of the intra-Africa links, because I have heard complaints from particularly operators in East Africa saying, well, we would come to South Africa, but why bother when we're buying the big pipes up north and we're not getting a price benefit. So the fact that you're doing that is positive. Maybe push that down to some of your existing customers, because I think some of them, with their long-term commits, have not bothered to come back talk to you about what your pricing really is.
Good to know. Thank you.
We have one more question or comment.
What's the minimum bandwidth circuit you'll do between countries in Africa? Say there isn't going to be as much as SDM1 between Kenya and Mozambique. There just isn't that much traffic. What's the minimum that you would do to enable peering to be worthwhile?
Look, we're open to the discussion, but I need to state very clearly, we're a wholesale player. And we're not equipped for it as a business to become a retail player and to go down to the E1 or the 2 meg service at this stage. We're a staff of 100 plus people. When you start getting into the game of providing 1, 2, or 5 meg services, you find yourself needing a business probably 10 to 20 times our size. So in spirit of the wholesale space, on our IP service side, we'll go down to 30 megs. And we believe that 30 megs is very much becoming an accessible amount of bandwidth, the way the pricing is going and also on demand. If you look at what we're experiencing today, I think with DFA we've lit up a couple of gigs of bandwidth in the room. So for everyone who hasn't downloaded their latest operating system, you feel free to do it here and enjoy the speed that's going around here. But we've just upgraded our office, and we're amazed at how we lived with a 4 meg line going into office now that we've moved up another notch. So we think 30 megs is relatively accessible and from our side consistent with the wholesale strategy. Thank you.
Okay, so my final question. What is the feel you get? And I would want to believe that with SEACOM coming onto the market, you don't have customers just from Africa going into Europe. You also do have customers from Europe looking to come into Africa. What is their perception? Is the pricing competitive, or do we still need to do more?
I think there are a lot of people who could answer that in this room. The reality is that pricing in Africa is still far behind, very far behind the mature markets. So when some of the big global carriers chat to any of the providers in Africa, they're generally horrified by the price, but also understand that it's a function of the limited supply and the economics that come with working in Africa. It's very different to working in Europe, where you've got much different levels of density and fiber in the ground and of course, competition. So, I think we're seeing a lot of growth and interest, specifically in the last 6 months, for major US and European carriers to try and get bandwidth into Africa. And, with more demand, it's driving prices down as well. So it's servicing everyone. But, we're still far away from an end consumer perspective from the prices that we're seeing in the mature markets.
Okay, thank you. I think we don't have any more questions, so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Aidan Baigrie for his excellent presentation. Thank you very much, and SEACOM as well, for sponsoring and supporting the AfPIF event. Thank you very much. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our first keynote of this AfPIF event. And we're also in time for the lunch. So just 1 or 2 announcements. As part of the surprises, remember yesterday we said there'll be lots of surprises as we go by. So we have polo shirts available for everybody. So you are welcome to pick up your polo shirt at the registration desk on your way out for lunch. Lunch will be served at the restaurant at the far end as was the case yesterday for those who are here. And we'll look back to having you here at 2 o'clock. And 2 o'clock will be the first panel session for the AfPIF. And this one will be looking at the discussion of how can we move packets from Cape Town to Cairo terrestrially, and what are the challenges from a regulatory point of view. So I think those from the regulator, I see CASA is in the house. I'm happy to see that. Lesotho. How can we actually move packets terrestrially, and how can we make that happen? Thank you very much, and see you at 2 o'clock.